Welcome to the Chuan podcast. My name is Isaac Kamens. This is a bi-weekly podcast where my friend Jess O'Brien and I discuss internal martial arts, qigong, and meditation. This week we continue our discussion on T.T. Liang. We are going to continue with stories from Stuart Olson's book, Steal My Art. We talk about his philosophy of stealing his art, amongst other things. Then we complete our discussion of the Pushing Hands song from various sources, and we discuss obviously pushing hands and different aspects of pushing hands as it relates to the classics. All right, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the episode. Take care of yourselves and be well.
All right, today we're going to talk a little more about the Yang style of Tai Chi and the famous master who taught in America, T.T. Liang. So here's a little bit about his life story from Steal My Art by Stuart Olson. That came out in 2002. Master Liang Tong Tsai was undeniably one of the most influential innovators of Tai Chi during our present era, a genuine living testament to the efficacy of long-term Tai Chi practice and a man of great charisma. Having taught thousands of students and influencing 1,000-fold more through his writings, Liang is indeed a true treasure to both the art of Tai Chi and to the lives of those fortunate enough to have met or studied with him. To live 100 years or more has always been his goal. In his words, to show everyone that my skill and art were correct. Basically, to shove it in everybody's face.
Like it.
That is the ultimate revenge. For a man who was given 2 months to live at age 45, and who outlived all his teachers and colleagues, he has certainly met his goal and shown the benefit of long-time adherence to the practice of Tai Chi. So he was given 2 months to live at age 45 from a life of alcoholic, drug, brothels, like everything you could do as a corrupt official.
Yeah. I mean, you can't argue with the results, right?
I mean, it's like you're age 75 at age 45 is kind of what it sounds like. He just burned himself out so much. All right, so let's look at a little bit more of his history here. Having the incredible good fortune of being born, as he says, in interesting times, Liang has lived through an era that included 2 world wars, the end of the Qing dynasty through the post-Mao period, the atom bomb, man on the moon, and the end of a millennium. His life bridged the industrial and technological revolution, seeing the growth of electricity, automobiles, flight, radio, television, and computers. His life in China began in poverty and resulted in great wealth, position, and power. Then coming to America during the chaotic 1960s with little money and no position of authority, he underwent a 180-degree change of life experiences. Retiring as the second highest ranked officer in British customs in China, he came to America to teach Tai Chi, an occupation that carried little respect in most Westerners' eyes. The fact that he has reached 100 years of life in great health pales in comparison to how much living he has actually experienced. Liang studied Tai Chi with Professor Cheng Man-ching for more than 20 years, becoming his chief and foremost disciple. Stories of his years with Professor Cheng are numerous, and some of them are included in this book. They had a great and close relationship, as well as a rocky and difficult one. The whole continued debate on Professor Cheng and Liang reminds me of a saying I once heard in a movie. Your lies are old, but you tell them good. The stories may sound believable, but they don't tell what really happened. It would be difficult to call Liang a Taoist, a Buddhist, or a Confucian, as he was all of them, and yet none of them. The best descriptions we can give him is that his playfulness was Taoist, his reverence towards his parents was Buddhist, and his passion for leading a life trouble-free and orderly was Confucian. His playfulness at times, however, was very devious. Sometimes his reverence was totally irreverent, and he loved to stir up trouble. Not for the desire to be evil, but for humor, so that those around him would learn to laugh at him and themselves. Let's see. Being Chinese, especially an older Chinese man, certainly helped fuel the fire of students who sought a master. Without question, he mastered the Tai Chi ideal of know yourself and you can know others. He may have taught Tai Chi, but his deserved title of master came less from that than from his life experiences. The closer I got to him, the more I realized that he had mastered himself. Tai Chi unquestionably played a great part in that, however, and it helped him restore his health and gain his martial skills. Many of his students never considered the fact that Master Liang had his knowledge and experience was received through his training and service in the British Maritime Customs Service in China. He acquired his high-ranking position by being a very intelligent man. During this time, he was also a high member in the Chinese mafia, which was a necessity for men in his position to remain alive. Listening to him tell stories of how he had to detect smugglers and drug dealers convinced me more and more that his cleverness and perceptive abilities were honed and sharpened long before he ever took up Tai Chi. In my opinion, Tai Chi only accentuated those skills. One of Liang's greatest abilities was to interrogate and trap. I've never met anyone who could get someone to reveal so much about him or herself in just a short conversation. This ability is without question a residual skill from his years in customs service. That's pretty sweet. So he could just like start tearing you up just on contact. So, oh, what are you wearing there? Oh, where'd you get that? Like that happened to me in customs one time where we were coming back from Taiwan, and the guard guy, when we got back to the States, said, "Oh, nice shoes. I was thinking about getting something like that." And like tried to engage me in the conversation because I think I got a new pair of shoes. Anyways, it was weird. It's like when a cop asks you a question and try a friendly sounding thing. Like I've learned that that's not friendly.
Not always,
right? They don't want to just have a joshing conversation. They want to open the door. During my many years with him, he suffered only once what I considered to be a serious illness. He was 85 years old at the time and had, for several days, suffered from constipation. Being very worried about him, I convinced him late one night to go to the hospital. They ran tests on him, and the results showed that his internal organs were very healthy. They were actually just as they should be for a 45-year-old man. His doctor concluded that Liang psychologically wanted to take a break from teaching and had a psychosomatic reaction. The doctor was incredibly surprised at how well preserved and youthful his internal organs were. When he came to Liang's room to release him, the doctor handed him a copy of Liang's own book and told him coyly that this was his prescription to cure the illness. Liang laughed. "I've been caught like a rat in my own trap."
Wish somebody would do that to Kumar.
Right? Ironically, many Tai Chi masters, especially those I've had the pleasure of knowing, live in seeming contradiction of their respective arts. Liang is definitely of this category. The reason I believe this happens to people who master their art is because the learning process and responsibilities that come with their accomplishments can be so overbearing that they seek outside ways to vent. Liang vented through humor and intimidation, which more often than not left many students thinking he did not take Tai Chi seriously. Students normally approach learning from him with the scenario of studying at the feet of the master, and he typically destroyed their illusions. Not because he was irreverent or because he didn't respect Tai Chi, or because he didn't care about them. He did so because he knew better than them that to be obsessive, too reverent, too serious would only serve to destroy their life and happiness. He believed that Tai Chi should be approached as a hobby, not as an occupation. But because Tai Chi became his occupation for a long period of his life, he had to vent the frustration of that duty with humor and intimidation. So I wanted to read about a section here that inspired us and has been sort of our calling card and our attitude you have to take to succeed. So this chapter is called Steal My Art. The real secret for learning from T.T. Liang was contained in his simple statement, "Steal my art." Few students understood the meaning of this, and even less took him seriously when he said it. The denser ones thought it meant not having to pay him. Steal my art was his game, however, and he had little patience with students who didn't play it. What made it difficult was that you had to play by his rules, which he rarely revealed, nor did he really let students know that there was even a game being played. Most students just came to his classes, learned some Tai Chi forms, and listened to his stories, banterings, or intimidations, and that was all they got. More often than not, he would fall asleep in his chair during class or leave to cook his food. At the end of a class, he would normally give a small speech on whatever interested him on that given day, collect his $10, and go off to eat, sleep, paint, or watch Wheel of Fortune, or do calligraphy. His classes were mostly fun, not intense learning periods. The only times I ever experienced what could be called an intense class was when he would come downstairs in the evening and attempt to teach me an entire form in the matter of a few hours. He didn't necessarily do this for my benefit, however, as I would learn the following day when a certain group of students would show up to learn the particular form that he had taught me the previous evening. He'd then have me teach them while he watched slumped in his chair. In his unique logic, he found it easier to teach me for 3 straight hours than to spend just a few minutes teaching other students. After each of these intense classes, he would walk away grumbling about how I was trying to steal his art, complaining how painful it was to be mugged and bugged by a bloody burglar. But actually, it was the game he himself was orchestrating. Keep in mind that he had to learn within an environment that was primarily based on this idea of stealing a master's art. It was not purely a game he invented, but one he had lived in his endeavor to master Tai Chi. Traditional teachers in Asia, especially during his time, could not be approached as they are in present times. Money was secondary. Trusting a student was of utmost importance. In some cases, Liang had to follow other students performing the form, and he could not even speak to the teacher until he had learned the entire form by assimilation. Some teachers he had to bribe with gifts and money over many months. Others tested his sincerity repeatedly. In the case of Professor Cheng, he had to serve him by helping him teach and being his right-hand man in many respects. The atmosphere for learning in his day was far more traditional and severe, and a student had to prove himself worthy. Now, however, anybody can sign up for a class, and the teacher will offer his services for a set fee, which explains why there are innumerable Tai Chi teachers barely able to convey even the basic health aspects. Liang's teachers were of a much higher caliber, teaching not only health, but very intense and deep levels of self-defense, mental accomplishment, and immortality. Liang tolerated the student who took up Tai Chi as the newest fad, but he kept his eyes open for those who could learn his entire art, those, from his perspective, who could steal it. When he came back from Taiwan, he did so specifically to help Jonathan and I steal his art, explaining to him that there was something quite valuable for us to learn, but he couldn't get it if he became obsessed with wanting it. An explanation is seen in how Buddhist masters teach their students about gaining insights of enlightenment. The idea is that if a student tried to look for enlightenment head on, it would evade him. But if the student ignored it, then it would wither and fade. If he kept mindful of enlightenment, however, he could catch glimpses of it out of the corners of his eyes through his peripheral vision. Interestingly enough, this is how the eyes should be maintained while practicing Tai Chi. One doesn't look at things, nor does one close the eyes to see nothing. Rather, the eyes take on a spatial view and simply follow the waist. Our task, as Liang explained, was simply to hang out and practice and catch the subtlety of his art out of the corner of your eyes. To directly attempt to steal his art could only create a situation where he would overanalyze and obsess trying to get it. If you don't hang out and practice, your interest would fade and wither, and the art would never be gained. But if you acted like a thief and were mindful of seeking out the corner of your eyes what you could steal, then you could discover something really valuable. So that's the idea of that I think has occurred to us even before we heard the phrase that, like, you can't put your mind 100%. Your mind isn't what's going to teach you. You got to learn stuff, but like, there's more than just seeking the information or seeing it on a video, for instance. To steal it is a process.
There's levels to stealing it, right? There's the watching, hearing things you're quote unquote not supposed to hear yet, that kind of thing.
So keep your ear open for the other room.
Which is, I mean, that's the, looking out the corner of your eye thing, right? Like the other level, it is do it wrong in front of them. Right?
Yeah, that's a favorite.
And practicing around your teacher. They may not be correcting you, but they're looking at you out of the corner of their eye, and they might see something.
When you do that, it's funny how the teacher ends up getting around to whatever it was that you needed without maybe consciously even, right? Like,
or it goes the other way though. They can be teaching something completely unrelated, and you pick up on some other thing that they're doing. They're not necessarily what they're talking about in the moment, but you just see something in their body or whatever. And everybody's got their own language for talking about this stuff and their own way of putting it together. And I think when your first thing is you got to learn your teacher's slang or whatever, their way of talking about some of these things. And then once you kind of get what their language is, then you can start to kind of, again, you use it against them, right? So you're trying, the interrogation thing kind of comes to mind, like they was talking about earlier, that if you can say, well, hey, I heard so-and-so does it like this, they'll go, oh, no, it's like this, and you can kind of do it that way. Or you can, you can say, well, it looks like you're doing this. And then, they go, no, let me show you what it really is. But if you just ask the question, how do you do it?
No,
that's not going to work.
Blank stare. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was young learning Aikido, one of the things I figured out to do was whenever the teacher was correcting somebody nearby, I would sort of listen from beside them. Sometimes you can even go over and look, but at least like listen if they're saying drop your elbow or control your knee somewhere, like I would just do that and see, apply it to myself, even though they were correcting someone else. And that'd be a way to like just keep gaining information. You kind of got to steal it. You can't.
Yeah, I mean that's
ask directly.
That's one of the easier ways, in a sense, to do it, is to just keep your eyes and ears open for when they're talking to someone else. One of the best ways to get better at anything is to do it with people who are better than you.
Exactly.
Right. So it doesn't matter if it's Tai Chi, music, weaving basket, whatever it is, right? If you just sit with someone who's better than you while they're doing it and you pay attention, you're going to pick up on stuff, and things will happen on a unconscious level that you can also pick up on. But even just even if you're unaware of that stuff, it still kind of seeps into you a little bit.
Another way is to take your teacher to lunch. That's a classic way of like,
Sure.
then they have no choice. They got to answer some of your questions while you're there. And like,
That was what he was saying about with Chang, how he had to kind of be his like, right-hand man or whatever.
yeah,
The best way is to do it through, hands-on, right? Like if you can get either to put your hands on your teacher when they're doing it to someone else, or to have, do the technique with them, that's the best way. I mean,
well,
to be the uke,
hands-on is always the best. Yeah, the uke,
yeah,
right.
that gives you a foundational thing, right? So
Right.
now I'll give, my own personal thing is I really only trained with one person. Just happened to be that the person I trained with did a lot of other things. So there was a constant, like if we would learn a technique,
Comparison, yeah.
well, not just a comparison, this is how you would use it against this. This is how you would use it against that. This is what this is for against this type of fighting. This is, and so you
could learn from his experience.
Yeah, and it was way more than I think I needed as far as to just learn how to do the applications. But
Right.
it sort of informs what you're doing in a way. So again, you kind of learn these things through osmosis. So like a lot of stuff that I've never trained, I can do it because of the control I have of my body, right? Like that I can do what other schools of Neigong or what other schools of Tai Chi are doing because I've learned to move my body. And I'm sure that they could do what I'm doing. I mean, that once you've learned a
Right.
complete system, you now have it's just like you have a framework
Yeah,
to
yeah.
put everything into. And
Right.
I
You've
think,
learned how to learn.
yeah, you have to learn an alphabet, right? And it doesn't, I think, matter that much. I mean, it could be like a long fist, it could be a Hungar form, it could be, Shingi 5 elements. You need some complete little chunk of something that you can say, okay, this is what I'm gonna like view the lens of everything through. So you start having a frame of reference for what things are, because if
Right.
you don't have a frame of reference,
Right.
it just you get lost in the weeds.
Right. You need a strong basis. I guess the other half of that is the danger that, especially when I was young in Aikido, there were people who didn't, they felt they would be contaminated by training anything else, and that they could only do Aikido with this one school, and they didn't want to go outside that because it might damage what, and it's like, that's not how it works.
If all you want to do is preserve slash
Yeah.
practice one thing, that's fine, and that's what you can do. But when you want to start talking about how do you use Tai Chi as a fighting art, you now have to start talking about all of these different, or as a health art for that matter, all of these different ways in which you can do it to adapt to different scenarios. If you have a bad back, you do Tai Chi differently than if you have a bad knee or if you're perfectly healthy, right? Those are all completely different scenarios. And if you're fighting, if you're training to fight in a ring is very different than if you're training to be a bouncer, which is very different than if you're training to be a soldier. I mean, all of these things have their place, but it's like practical thing of what are you doing it for is really the first question you got to ask.
Turning now to the playing hand song of Taiji Chuan, as translated by Barbara Davis in her book, The Taiji Chuan Classics from 2004. This is one of those Tai Chi classics that some people have, some people don't. And it's pretty short, but it's the one that applies the most to combative technique and two-person training. So we thought we'd see what kind of mysteries it might have. So last time it talked about making it unifying your body so the opponent can't really get at you. So the next phrase is this: no matter how much force he hits me with a 4-ounce pull, I dispel his 1,000 pounds. So this is where the famous slogan of 4 ounces, you only need 4 ounces to, well, I don't think it actually comes from here. It's in other places too, but it's pretty much a core Tai Chi belief slash practice slash goal to use the slightest amount of force to deflect a much larger amount of force. That's when you know you're doing Tai Chi right, is when that happens. not overwhelming someone with your strength, but using the least amount of energy you can possibly expend to deflect their attack. So she says here, this reminds us that Taiji Chuan is an up-close martial art. An amount of fearlessness is required. This process is described by Zheng Manjing as investing in loss, by other people described as eating bitterness. We must be ready and willing to actually encounter the opponent's blows in order to learn these techniques. So hey, that pretty much connects with what we were just talking about, actually. The idea is you have to get in range to get hit before you can really apply any of this. It can't be done from a long distance, really. You've got to be in close range and be willing to accept that force before you can even begin to dissolve and deflect that force.
Yeah, and this is sort of a callback to the Tai Chi Chuan Lun, where they bring up the 4,000 pound 4 ounces defeats 1,000 pounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of like explaining what that means in terms of push hands or whatever. But this is like a callback to that piece of the earlier text, right? So I mean, that goes to my theory that this one is written later on as a
it sounds
supplemental thing to kind of explain how to do push hands, right? But
memorize the ditty.
Yeah, and it's not a literal four. I mean, I think everybody probably knows this, but it's not a literal 4 ounces, right?
Right.
It's about being able to essentially stay ahead of the force coming at you, right? That you're not letting more than 4 ounces of pressure land on you. Essentially,
that's as much as you're allowing it, because you can't just jump out of the way. Like she points out, hey, you've got to get in there and take the hit, and from there your deflection begins. You can't just run all the time. Like that's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, because I think, well, and this is one of the sort of really characteristic flaws in a lot of Tai Chi fighting stuff is people don't actually learn the part about, what do you do up close? Right?
Yeah,
because it's not just collapse and be squishy, because if you do that, the person will just crush right through you. So, there's a lot of it that has to do with, sensitivity, essentially. All right. I mean, that this is about when you're up close, you're dealing with much shorter increments of time, right? Whereas if you've got a long punch coming at you from 4 feet away, you got all time in the world.
It brings to mind a phrase that Lo Deshu of Taiwan was using in one of his classes that was like, he explained it in Chinese, but then he tried to translate to English, was like, sooner or later, you have to ask her father to marry her. Like, you can dance around and you can make moves and you can delay and deflect, but sooner or later, you got to get close to that opponent and
you got to commit.
You got to commit. You got to get in there. And, nobody wants to do it, but you got to just get in there and deal.
Well, and I think this is, again, why, one of the hardest things to get over is that hesitation between, I'm going to do it, and I throw the punch, right?
Right, you got it.
There's that little bit of inside everybody that kind of holds it back,
right?
And I think what you learn in Tai Chi is that you can be as soft as you want, but once Bruce talks about the hole in the net, right? That once you find that opening, you go, right? So you can play around and feel and be sensitive and all of that when there's no gap for you to enter. But as soon as a gap presents itself, you got to take advantage of it. Otherwise, the moment is gone.
Right. And that gap will disappear.
And this is a big part of, like, it's the Sun Tzu stuff, right? The idea that, they attack first, but I arrive first. Well, the main way that happens is through having better angles, essentially, or better positioning. And so a lot of this is about learning how to use positioning and moving your body. It's not just about being weak.
Right. So
And
TT
sloppy.
Liang takes a shot at it too. He says, even though he should come and attack with great force, use a push and pull of 4 ounces to deflect a momentum of 1,000 pounds. He says, even if one is attacked with great force, there's no need to be afraid. One must control his mind like a commanding general. If Mount Tai were to collapse in front of him, his expression wouldn't even change. So that's that bravery that Barbara Davis was talking about.
Yeah,
And
this is
yeah,
the idea that a big part of what you're all this stillness training, right, is so that when something happens, you don't, we use the term gap, right? You don't gap when there's a a change, and the whole thing of staying present through the um connected string of movements, right? This idea of an internal connection that keeps everything linked up. Big reason you're doing that is because then when something happens, you don't have as there aren't as big of gaps, right? There's fewer places for your mind or your body to gap.
yeah,
And when something's coming at you and you're trying to be just ahead of it and lead it past you, you can't have any gaps, right? Because as soon as you have a gap and you stop moving, that thing is going to hit you, right? And so this is where again, it, it's a very active, even though it's yin.
yeah, it's active. Yeah. Well, and TT says something to that effect of saying, one cannot deal with all situations in the same manner or settle the matter with one simple deflection. If you use too much or insufficient energy, or if the direction is too straight or too much inclined, one will fall into the error of letting go or resisting. And then no technique can be applied successfully. The student should not take this as something to talk about easily or to look at lightly. In fact, it appears easy, but to practice it is quite difficult.
Well, that's
Fair
everything,
enough.
right? I mean, when you see somebody who's good at it do it, it looks easy. When you try it, it not so
Right.
easy.
Suddenly looks real hard.
And then, no, this is one of the, I mean, I think one of the biggest things about why Tai Chi is hard to get and misunderstood by a lot of people is because we don't have a frame of reference for softness. And so the way almost everybody initially interprets softness as just completely going limp,
Limp.
you know,
Yeah.
being just letting everything go. And that's not what they're talking about here, and so the mind part that he mentions, right? That you have to do it with your intent, because if your mind isn't lively while this is happening, if you kind of just go to sleep and go and think that
Yeah. That kind
turning
of
your hips,
softness ain't going to help.
mm, that works if the other this is what I was saying earlier about, if the other person's playing the same game as you, then
Sure.
it
Yeah. I see what you're
works,
saying.
right?
Yeah.
But if the other person isn't cooperating with you in any way, then it really falls apart quick. Um, this idea of, push hands, really only allows you to do these type of things if both people agree that that's what you're doing. If the other person's, just charging at you and shoving you, I mean, you kind of like can't just sit there and be like, well, now I'm going to try to relax my shoulders. You have to respond to what's happening in real time. And so, this is a different thing than just, playing hands with your friends and going really slowly and trying to feel what's happening is a, a, an awesome and useful tool, but that's not what you're going to do when, a drunk guy shoves you in the bar, it's like, or whatever. It's, so you have to kind of make that distinction about I'm not or, I am doing X, Y, or Z, and I'm not doing A, B, and C. And as long as you're clear about that, I don't think there's any harm in it. But, know the difference between that experience of, oh shit, and you're scared in that moment, and can you still do something, versus you're with another person, you've both agreed that, okay, we're going to do this thing, and then, within that you might have a little bit of, oh, but it's not like, you don't ever feel like your life is in danger. And I think when you feel like your life is in danger, things change.
Yeah, they get different.
Even if it's like you're pretty sure it's not gonna, you know, end badly, you still, your
There's a
adrenaline
lot of
kicks.
chemicals in your system, man.
Yeah, and it's like, when that monkey brain kicks in and all those, you adrenaline and everything starts running through your body, you know, your brain it doesn't like it can't really make the difference between that thing that's coming at you and like a tiger or something. It's like fear and all that stuff, right? So this is where training is about being able to do it when you're freaking out, right? Not when you're calm. Not anybody, but it's a lot easier to do it when you're calm. When you're like, oh my god, and then you do it. That's what it's really about. And so it's hard to mimic that in a class, right? I mean, this is where sparring is useful, but it still doesn't get you to that same place. And I don't know if anything does. And, that's why you train, because you hope that your training, prepares you for that real time thing. But, you're never going to find out. Hopefully you never find out, right? I mean, that's the
Definitely.
highest level of the training is you
Right.
don't end up in that situation. But I think it's a fantasy to think that, oh, just because when I do it with my buddies that it's that's going to be again, fighting isn't push hands, and don't treat push hands like fighting, and don't treat fighting like push hands. That
Good advice.
The mindset you're in when you're doing push hands is about trying to refine all this stuff from Tai Chi, and to learn to use the skills of Tai Chi in in fighting and stuff. But it's like there's a bunch of stages between push hands and fighting that you have to go through.
Yeah.
So
well, we should just finish the pushing hands song.
might as well.
Here's the final quote. So you've deflected the person. Now there's two more lines. So it says, I lead him in and he falls into emptiness. I unite with him and immediately issue and send out the force. Fa.
Right.
And
so this is
so there you go. So you've deflected him. Now you lead him, then you launch him.
right. So you deflect, absorb, whatever with the 4 ounces, right? Then you put them in the position you want them to be in. You get the angle, and then you discharge.
So she says here that that he falls into emptiness is literally to fall empty. Due to the ambiguity of the language used, it could be interpreted as attract him to emptiness, loses his balance, he falls emptily, falls into a hole, or he falls after emptying.
And it's all of those things.
Right.
No,
it's that
I'm
disconcerting feeling as you sort of lurch out of control for a slight instant.
Well, because
and you get
because
pushed
there's
right at that
getting
moment.
the person to lurch, there's getting the person to lift,
to lunge,
to I mean, well, that's what I mean by lift,
lift, lurch, lunge, all those. Yeah.
I mean, there's pulling them up by their root. I mean, there's a ton of different things that can happen in this. Yeah. So I mean, that's where I think the ambiguous language is there on purpose, right? Because it leaves it open to, it's not just one one thing.
And so we end with I adhere, connect, stick, and follow. I don't lose the connection and I don't resist.
Yeah. So this is
that's
adhere,
the instructions
connect,
right there.
Stick and follow, right? That's the kind of the 4 parts of the push hands pattern, right?
Mm-hmm.
You stick to them, adhere.
Zan, Liang, Nian, Sui.
Right. So you're using these 4 sort of things, and then the other part is about you're just not letting go.
I know Kumar would sometimes say budu buding.
Yeah.
Budu buding, meaning don't let go and don't resist either.
The agreed upon thing of push hands is that you don't let go, right? That's really, I mean,
I like how T.T. Liang explains it like this. An expert strategist often uses an empty camp to lure the enemy, waits until the enemy attacks the empty place, and then attacks him with his concealed troops. This is the meaning of all the above. So the idea being you let them come in but they find that the camp's been abandoned, but then you come rushing out of the woods and attack them by surprise. And that's what Tai Chi is all about.
sounds good.
All right, man.
Talk to you soon.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Hey, folks, thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for supporting us through 3 seasons. I just want to make a little announcement. The regular feed, not the Patreon feed, is going to begin to have ads next season. So if you want to keep listening without the ads, you can join for just $5 a month, gets you the regular subscription, and then $10 a month to get the premium subscription, which has all the full archive and all the interviews and everything. Okay, that's all for now. Again, thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves and be well.